Today's episode is brought to you by Positively Productive Systems, whose mission is to be the antidote to your stress and to provide compassionate productivity resources and coaching that help you heal and achieve. Be sure to check out both free and paid resources at positivelyproductive.com/resources.
Your energy is so intrinsically linked to your amount of clarity. So when you have a clear idea of how you want to feel, what you want to focus on, and what you want to do, it is that much easier to take action. And when we don't have to constantly make those decisions, we're not left with that decision fatigue, right? And I believe all these things truly impact our mental capacity.
You're listening to the Positively Living podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Zaratny, founder of Positively Productive Systems and a coach certified in time and stress management, helping clients make space for what matters most in their lives. Join me each episode and we'll talk about decluttering, stress management, habits, personalized productivity, gratitude, and so much more. I understand the overwhelm of life because I'm a wife, mom to kids and cats, and a former caregiver. I'm here to help you choose what's right for you so you can do less, live more, and breathe easier. Sound good? Let's get to it. Welcome back to the Positively Living podcast. Today's episode brings up one of my favorite topics, energy management. It's the unsung hero when we're searching for better time management. We have the same amount of time to work with, so what we need to pay attention to is what we can do in that time, and that is affected by our energy. If you feel like you struggle with time management, you'll want to listen to this episode. You're going to think of how you spend your time so differently after this conversation. My guest today is Sarah Steckler, a fellow productivity strategist who helps creative entrepreneurs organize their life and business with Notion and turn their ideas into self-published planners and journals. She's the host of the Mindful Productivity podcast and author of the Daily Productivity and Brain Dump book. With a name like Mindful Productivity, you know I had to invite Sarah to talk with me. We have a tremendous overlap in terms of our principles and approaches, but complement each other in terms of products and services. Her specialty is in Notion and journal creation, and my focus is coaching and training. And today we're joining forces to share how intentionality and curiosity can bring out our productive best. Sarah shares her story that led her to being a strategist that creates resources instead of coaching. She paid close attention to her energy and love of being a creator to design a life and business that had so much ease. She had a surprising reaction to it, guilt. You'll want to listen to her description of that. It's such a good reminder that our mindset constantly needs tending. To wrap up, Sarah leaves us with 2 very simple steps, 1 question and 1 action that will help us identify our energy management needs and find the clarity necessary to focus and be truly productive. She also gives us some great bonus tips on using Notion for organizing all those amazing ideas. Speaking of amazing ideas, if that's the reason you're having a hard time choosing what to do, if you have a ton of them to the point of overwhelm, I can help you process them in a strategy session. I invite you to start with a connection and assessment call where we'll figure out what kind of support is best for you. Head to positivelyproductive.com/call. Welcome, Sarah Steckler, to the Positively Living podcast. Before we get into our topic of the day, which I cannot wait to dig in with you, I'd love it if you would tell us a bit about who you are, who you help, and what makes you light up.
Thank you so much for having me. It's just good to see your face, and I'm excited to chat with you today. Yeah, so I'm Sarah Steckler. I'm a productivity strategist, and I help online entrepreneurs create and publish planners online. And I also help them set up the back end of their business primarily with Notion, which I love to geek out about. But when I'm not focusing on business, what really lights me up is time journaling, time in nature, long walks with my bulldog, if she will walk. But yeah, I love to spend as much time outside as possible with my journals. That is number 1.
There you go. So it's really fitting that you help create them. because you love to use them. And that makes total sense. So, of course, the fact that your blog, your podcast is named Mindful Productivity, it led me to you like a beacon, right? And we connected on Instagram, and it was just like, okay, we have to talk. This is amazing. And I would love for you to share a bit more here with everyone of your story as to how you were led to mindful productivity.
Sure. Well, I had a pretty big life adventure in my mid-20s and moved across the country with my husband. Kind of felt like I was having this quarter life crisis. So I went back to school and I tried to recreate a lot of stuff. I don't know if you've ever felt that way, but for anyone listening where you just feel kind of lost, it can be really easy to try to want to recreate something in your life. And I learned really quickly how much misery that caused me instead of really accepting the present moment. And while I went back to school for health and wellness coaching, I found myself constantly interested in productivity strategies and really loved the mindfulness components of the things that I was learning. So, more mainstream, when you think of mindfulness, more mainstream things like meditation, of course, but also just really learning, the power of the narrative we have with our thoughts and kind of the story that we tell ourselves and what we look to be true, right? It's kind of like the story of the two wolves, right? Whichever one you feed, right, is going to be more fueled. And I really found myself reflecting in my life of, wow, there was a lot of different narratives that I really was fueling that maybe weren't serving me in the best way. And so while I continued getting my master's degree in health and wellness coaching and really enjoyed that, I found that I was kind of creating these different ways of being productive to get through my master's program. So for anyone that goes back to school, especially as an adult, when you have other responsibilities, how much time that can take. So I found that a lot of productivity strategies online they seem to be a little more geared towards, or they came from a lot of men in the industry. And there was some really great tips there, but they all seem to kind of lack this connection to intention or connection to your energy level or your capacity. And so I found myself going, sure, like a lot of these things could work if I was a robot, but I'm not, I'm a human. So I really started incorporating more journaling and reflection setting. Eventually, my business kind of turned into this niche. So while I started out coaching, eventually I started the Mindful Productivity podcast in 2018 and really just started running with this topic and really talking about how can we integrate the two, right? How can we realize that to be productive doesn't mean that we have to hustle all the time, and that actually means we can feel really grounded and connected to ourselves. And success doesn't have to look like consistent burnout all the time, because that was kind of where I found myself over and over again, was this cycle.
Can we just take a moment? Do you want an extra microphone to drop? Because yes, thank you. Okay, how familiar is this now? You know why I wanted Sarah with us today, because this intentionality, and that word is one of my favorites. And you're right, this was definitely something I experienced as well, starting as a professional organizer and moving into the productivity side of things in the industry and even attending industry events. We had both there in the national association that I was part of, but it was very clearly that the productivity was kind of the men's side, if you will. And they were drawing from, I felt like, a lot of corporate culture in terms of productivity, because again, and we talked about this many times on the podcast, going back to this idea of productivity and doing more, the Industrial Revolution, how much more can we get done? And just like you said, we're not robots, and we have so much going on and integrated into our lives that we want to be able to get what we need to get done, but in a much more fluid and satisfying and fun way. And I'm so with you on that. I love all of the things you're saying. It's not just about avoiding burnout too, but one of the things that you described, there was a word that came up for me, and it was something that you were feeling in your quarter life crisis that was that you weren't doing, but then you were led to it by exploring productivity in this way, and that's being present, right?
Yeah, I think too, and I love that you brought in corporate culture, because that's essentially, I think, what a lot of the productivity stuff stems from.
Yeah.
And a lot of great strategies. But I found that for a creative, for someone that's, running an online business, maybe your work hours are different. It didn't quite hit, but yes, being present. And I think in being present comes a level of accepting the present moment. And one thing about acceptance is it doesn't mean putting up with or not reaching your full potential or saying, oh, this is what is, that's it. But more so acceptance is going, well, what really is happening? What are the facts of the situation, right? Like, and being present with that, whatever obligations you have, whatever struggles you're going through. For me at that time too, it was a mixture of mental health, a lot of depression setting in. And so it was realizing that I was in this place in my life that was very new and I had no idea. You go your whole life going through college and you feel like you've got a path and everyone's kind of on the same path with you. And then at some point, we all hit a place where we realize we're kind of diverging in different directions. So acceptance of the present moment really is looking at the facts of the situation you're in. And from there, I feel like too, you also can accept your energy level. You can accept your capacity. You can accept your creative abilities or maybe how you might want to do things differently. And so that can lend to how you run your business, how you get work done, how you structure your days, all of that.
I love that because it's a good way to reframe this idea of acceptance because there seems to be a confusion. I think it's one of the reasons why I love the Sophia Bush quote about you're allowed to be a work in progress and a masterpiece simultaneously, because it's about accepting who you are in this moment or maybe how things are as you're doing whatever it is that you're trying to do. And by doing that, you lean into what's happening as you make your adjustments, as you course correct and head toward whatever goal that it is. But that word that's in there that you brought up, and that's like the theme of the day here is energy. And that's something that you really learned to follow. Can you talk more about that, please?
Yeah. Well, one thing I learned about running my own business, especially and like creating content and all these things, was that I only had so much energy for all these things, obviously, but my creative capacity too was limited. And I didn't always know when certain parts of my brain would be available to myself. When would I feel inspired to do a podcast, right? I wanted to be in a decent mood when I record, things like that. And I noticed that when you run a business, when you wear many, many different hats, and all of a sudden you're learning marketing, you're learning how to, build confidence all over again as you show up online. I noticed that with all these new things came a different and sometimes heavier energy drain. So sometimes I would find that I would be totally able to do maybe some back end administrative things in my business or check emails. But the thought of getting on a call or going live in a group or something like that just felt unobtainable in those moments. And so I really started thinking about my energy capacity and what that really looks like and what drove me, what drained me, what things in my business and my life were energy producing, which things were maybe a little bit more draining. And I realized in talking with other friends and entrepreneurs that it was different for all of us. While some of my coaching friends got so inspired and lit up, and they could do multiple one-on-one coaching sessions with clients a day, I found that I was very limited in that area. And so certain things in my business that even were, revenue producers were really draining me in a way that left me with almost little to none, energy capacity or creative capacity for doing other things in my business. So that actually eventually led me to restructuring my whole business model, but it really started allowing me to ask myself that question. And we can all ask ourselves this question, like, what are my energy drivers? What are the things that help me produce that energy? What are the things that drain me? And letting go of any guilt and just really kind of jumping into what are those things and identifying them.
I love that you mentioned the guilt part, and a specific action item right away is asking that question. That's step one when you stop listening to step away is ask yourself that question, because there's two sides to it, what drives you and what drains you. But that guilt part about saying, okay, that's not going to work for me, or maybe it might not even be guilt. It could be, at least I've seen with my clients, it could be shame, or it could be sort of a questioning of the supposed tos, the shoulds, the things like that. How do you get beyond that to make that choice? How can we inspire them to make this choice?
One thing that always helps me, and I did learn this in studying mindfulness, was to get curious. So anytime I have frustration or guilt or anxiety, it's to get curious about the moment. So that's the first thing I did was, okay, one-on-one coaching is maybe not the business model for me. Why? Like what's behind that, right? So instead of going, oh, you should, or you just spent hours and hours and hours of coach training and doing all this and building your business model around this, therefore you should continue to be a coach in that way. Instead, I said, well, what's on the other side of this, or what's possible, or what did I learn from all this coaching experience? What did I learn from all this training that could be applied in a different way? How might I be able to help other people? And also, what might my days look like with my energy if I really was feeling fulfilled? If instead of, having a giant balloon that was constantly deflating all day until I got to the very end, what if, it deflated a little and then it was filled back up? And so there was this kind of consistent floating, if you will, of that balloon throughout the day. And so in getting curious, that helped drop the guilt. And I think that could be applied to anything in our lives, right?
Well, we've talked about curiosity on this podcast almost every episode. I would love somebody to go through and count how many times I'm like, so curiosity, but it's true. Here's why, because when you step into curiosity, you step away from judgment. And when you step away from judgment, you open yourself up to innovation. And what you did was innovate. You're like, okay, this is not working for me. And it's not only why isn't it working for me, but what could it look like if I did something that did work for me? The what if, I love that question. What if, what's possible and how could it look? And being very confident in the fact that we do have these options. I just had a conversation with Alicia Galati. She is the brains behind the podcast production here at Positively Living, and one of my favorite people. And, she was talking about how she has a particular kind of business with a model that's an agency model where so many people were saying, don't do it that way. Why not? If it works for you. I have a really good friend. I do IG lives with her every Friday. And she said, I just had an entire day of like facilitating a workshop, and then I was drained the next day. But I also know that she feeds off of that. She loves that. So then you kind of know, you're like, okay, this feeds me, then this drains me because I've given it all. So then the next day you don't book stuff, you learn how to find the ebb and flow, right? But I'm still really excited and fascinated and just in the moment here with you about making a choice about how your business is going to look, the model of it based on what is working for you and not working for you. So were you able to see any other comparisons or anyone else doing what you were doing, or did you just build it from the ground up? How did you approach it?
I definitely was inspired by other course creators I saw online, right? Like other people running online programs. And that gave me the, the boost to say, okay, look, at other people are doing it. Things are possible. And I remember though, at first thinking, okay, the majority of my income is coming from my clients. And then at some point I've got to tell them that I'm not going to do one-on-one coaching anymore. So there was that element of it too, right? Like really making sure that there was an offboarding that felt good and that everyone understood where I was coming from. But then it was also excitement was mainly what I really felt, but there was definitely some unknowns, how now I've got to get more people, right? I've got to get in front of more people and I have to have more students enrolling in programs to make up for the difference of a business model that was coming from higher ticket, one-on-one coaching. So there was a shift in, okay, what's possible? What are the logistics? What all of that. But more so, it was what actually came later was there was the little bit of twinge of guilt in making the decision. The guilt really set in and was what I really had to work through later when it started being really successful, when I started making more money than I'd ever made. And when I felt so much happier in my business and when I had, more open days with fewer calls and I could literally create however I wanted, or I could work for an hour and then go to the park for the rest of the day and do a lot of creative planning. That's when a lot of the guilt set in for me. Like it was a lot of the, oh, do I really deserve this? Do I really get to have this? This feels so good. Like, where's the struggle? And I think some of that could have been carried over from corporate culture too, just like always feeling kind of a twinge of, oh, this isn't that fun. Like work shouldn't be fun kind of thing. Work should be work. And don't get me wrong, it is a ton of work, but I love it so much. And like you said, there's part of things that fuel you and part of things that drain you. And it's about creating your schedule and your business model around that. But I thought it was very interesting. It's still something I work through. It's like, who am I to deserve or really embrace this when it's so wonderful and it's so much better? Because after I'd started my business, I really thought that for the longest time, the struggle would be, well, you get to run your own business, so it has to be difficult. And it's very interesting to see that that's kind of the biggest mindset shift I've had to kind of endure.
Yeah, that's powerful too, to say, okay, I got through the offboarding the clients and making the shift and stepping into my own thing. And then the guilt comes up, the challenges come up when you're like, oh, this is working. Wait. And I love the phrase, well, I get a kick out of the phrase because we need to address it. And I'm so glad that you said it, which is where's the struggle? Like, and we do this. There's, I think the hustle culture is a big one we talk about here. And I think somehow it's just been ingrained in us that, like you said, well, if you're going to be successful, you need to work hard, or it needs to be difficult, or if it's difficult, then it's worthwhile, instead of understanding that playing to your strengths. I talked about this with Julia DeConeva, and this idea that we think, okay, well, if it's easy, if we're working with our strengths here, there must be something wrong. And it's not, it's quite the opposite. We have to get used to that as being a cue that we're actually on the right track.
And I think too, it can be, I find myself doing that too with setting deadlines in my business. Or, I had to catch myself recently going, oh, I feel all this need to, I'm currently revamping one of my programs and there's no deadline for it except for the one I set, right? And what I let my students know. But I found myself going, you've got to do it fast. You've got to do it as fast as possible. And I found that I'm very deadline driven. So I definitely have a bit of an adrenaline rush when I know that I'm working up against a deadline. So I try to use that to my advantage. But at the same time, I was going, I'm really stressing myself out. Like I'm very stressed. Why am I doing this? Right? Why am I kind of recreating? And I think we do that, and not necessarily out of self-sabotage, but I think more so out of habit. We've gotten into the habit of things being difficult. And so it can become natural or quote unquote normal to kind of create that again. So it's kind of a practice. It's a practice of reintegration, rethinking about how can I structure these things and give myself more time and give myself that space. And that's one thing I love to do with energy management and creating projects too, is really adding in that buffer time, which looking back at the things I did in my corporate job, it's like, I could never imagine telling my boss, well, we're going to need like a day off in between projects, or we're going to need more breaks, where now that's absolutely something I do in my business.
But it's truly linked to our productivity. We know that when we have that break and we come back, we work better, faster, fewer mistakes. We're inspired in a different way completely. So at the end of the day, when you add it all up, when you're looking at the big picture, you're like, oh, I probably did that faster than I would have if I hadn't taken the break, if I had pushed through. And so what you're talking about, again, it's being curious. It's the constant questioning, which is like my favorite thing, just always the minute you find yourself in that speak, right, of, oh, I need to get this done, or I need to, do it faster, or whatever, or I should, the shoulds and things like that. If you can catch that and then say, why? Make sure you have a good reason.
Yeah, that's huge.
So how about next steps for us in terms of or it could be an example of your specific practice or what you do, maybe in terms of journaling and connecting to mindfulness and staying curious. You did mention the energy management part there with creating buffer time. Thank you. Love that. But we're going to ask the question, right? What drains us and what drives us? And we're going to have those answers. And then what? What are maybe a step or two after that we can take from there?
I think one of the things, at least for me personally, that will drain me very quickly is not having an awareness of all the noise and the narrative in my brain. And it's not necessarily negative things. Sometimes it's tons of ideas. And it's those questions, what if this, what if that, right? So for me, a almost daily practice is doing a structured brain dump and really giving myself space and time to capture all of these ideas. Because I think we have this almost like self FOMO of, well, what if I don't take action on all these ideas, right? And we can spread ourselves too thin. And there's so much power and focus, but there's also that rebellion of, well, what if I just did everything anyway? And so doing a brain dump allows me to feel like I'm holding space for all of these ideas. And many of them never happen, right? But they're always collected somewhere. And it also allows me time to brain dump out fears, anxieties, worries, things that are on my mind apart from my business, because we're not just our business, we are ourselves, right? So really giving myself time to do that. And when I first started doing brain dumps, they were just on a blank piece of paper. And I found that sometimes I really just didn't know where to start, or I didn't really think I had a lot of stuff in my brain. So I started creating kind of like templated brain dumps, asking myself questions like, what are the things currently in the scope of your control, right? What is outside of your control? And then knowing those two things, like, what do you want to change? And giving myself more structured prompts, but in a brain dump format where it didn't necessarily have to be me writing lines and lines of text. It could just be scribbles or doodles or words. That really allowed me to do it more effectively. Because I think sometimes with journaling, there can be a lot of friction that we create. Well, I've got to journal every morning, or I've got to journal for an hour every day. And so making it as easy as possible and going, you just need to do a brain dump. You don't even have to write a sentence. That has allowed me to do it almost daily for years now. And it really, really helps declutter my mind. And I find that your energy is so intrinsically linked to your amount of clarity. So when you have a clear idea of how you want to feel, what you want to focus on, and what you want to do, it is that much easier to take action. And when we don't have to constantly make those decisions, we're not left with that decision fatigue, right? And I believe all these things truly impact our mental capacity. So that really, in a big way, kind of sets me up to go, okay, you've got a clear head. What do you want to do? And then it's that much easier to make decisions and take action.
Absolutely. You've decluttered your mind, as I like to call it. And so I'm a big fan of that as well. And I have the focus file, that same idea that David Allen, talks about what has your attention. And the thing of it is that if you don't pay attention to what has your attention, then it's going to hog up the space, just like you're saying. And then you can't find the clarity. You can't find the sheer focus, because there's always something that clutter is always nagging at you and holding you back from being able to be like, okay, I am, again, going back to being present, right? Being present and in the moment, especially when it comes to creating. What I absolutely love about the tweaks that you've made to this are the idea that you want to include things that are what you might consider beyond your goals or your to-dos or tasks or whatever, the idea of fears and anxieties, just really anything. It's truly saying, what's got your attention, and putting all of that down. And then the other thing you talked about is like habits 101 right here, making it as easy as possible, giving yourself all the leeway to be like, do you just want to doodle out these thoughts? Go for it. I am curious, and I'd love to segue into this because I know it's your thing, and I'd love to hear a little bit about it. Do you take any of this, which you are like journaling? I'm going to assume, but maybe we'll just double check that you're journaling by hand. Do you put this in Notion? Like, what do you do next?
Yeah. So I actually created a brain dump book specifically for this. So there's my brain dumps on one page, and then it's a 2-page spread. And then on the other side, there's the daily productivity page. So most of my brain dumps end up in some way shaping kind of the basic to-dos of my day. But one thing I love to do is every month, and I kind of tie this into my monthly planning, is I will go back through all of my brain dumps, and I will cross out things that like no longer bother me or that I just don't need to ever look at again. Or I will highlight ideas or I'm like, ooh, that's really fun. Or, ooh, maybe that idea isn't going to be a physical product, but maybe that could be a workshop in something I'm doing. And so I take all those and I actually go to the back of my brain dump where I have these like list pages. And I write down things that I want to keep top of mind again. So it's kind of basically like filtering out my brain dumps into like the next level brain dump and
Mhm.
putting all those things on paper. And I find that even though it can be a little bit more tedious, I find that really, for me personally, writing out things by hand, I really feel like that declutters my mind in a more powerful way than just typing. So that's where I start. And then from there, anything that I see could be a possible project or a possible task will go into my dashboard in Notion, where I have, a master task list, and I also have focus projects in there. So those things will get broken out and put in there. And, if I'm really good and I really know what I'm doing, then those things will also have respective like due dates, right? Like DUE dates and DO dates when I'm doing them and when I want to have them done by. So that's kind of how those things migrate into my productivity system. But I find that's really, really helpful to kind of go back through them. And it's also kind of this lovely reminder of, ooh, that thing was really bothering you last week and it's not anymore. And I think in the moment too, that's a question I always like to ask myself when I'm struggling with something is this going to bother you like tomorrow or a week from now or a year from now? And just kind of remembering that things are cyclical and they don't always stay with us forever. So that's my process.
That's so encouraging. And I would actually counter, but in the same encouraging way of letting you know what needs to be taken care of. If you see something coming up repeatedly,
Yes.
then you can add more energy to it and say, okay, this keeps coming up. I need to address this in a different way. And that's actually great because that's prioritizing for you. And what you're talking about in terms of going through and reviewing what we've taken notes on and what we've journaled, that's so important. And I truly believe it's something that we don't do enough. And that's, I think, in part because we need the space to do it. So that's a really awesome technique. When you have that next level, right? You've done the filtering process. What goes into Notion? Is that only things that you're like, okay, that's a specific project, or do you have a capture in Notion where you can then pull them into specific projects?
Yeah, I have a variety of different dashboards in Notion, and within those, there's different databases that are linked. And so, what I love about Notion is you can easily drag and drop things anywhere. So, and then you can surface information anywhere. So, I actually have places in my dashboards for idea capture. So, sometimes those brain dump things will go into like kind of holding tanks. Like, this is an idea. I don't know what it's going to be yet, but I don't want to forget it. And then there's other places where those things actually get formed into projects. And the majority of them are projects because as we know, projects are, lots and lots of tasks. And so many of us have been like, put a task on our thing like, oh, just build a website when we know that is a project. And there's many,
Right.
many pieces of that. So most of those things go into projects. And then from there, I have templates inside of all of those that ask me questions that help me figure out like what are obstacles, what are deadlines, what are things I need to research. And so that kind of guides my brain through that process.
I love that. And that also sounds like something that you could absolutely construct in something like ClickUp or Trello, even. So I love that because, again, remember, it's about the process, not the platform. But I do agree, Notion has a really wonderful way to nest and connect things. And it's really relational. And it also is, I think, a space where you can create things in a very beautiful way. And if that's something that matters to you, if visually having something that is appealing energizes you, that's definitely a good place to play. Okay. Is there anything else? Some parting thoughts, if you will, or something that you're like, I really want to get this point in here and leave you with this today as we're thinking about energy and mindfulness?
I think that a lot of people start thinking about habits and then immediately start Googling habit trackers. And what I want to say about that is yes, I love them. But if you reframe habits and think about which habits produce energy for you, you're going to be a lot more likely to stick with them because I think it can be really tempting to see like like those posts, like, what are the millionaires doing every day, right? Or whatever.
Yeah.
And instead really think like, what are the tiniest things that I could do with the least amount of friction that would really energize me? I mean, even something like having a cup of water the first thing when you get up instead of checking your phone, really starting to implement those things and keep track of how you feel and how they energize you. Because if you're trying to do a daily habit and it doesn't bring you something, whether it's joy or it doesn't improve your environment, right? Like The Sims, like if it doesn't bring you joy, anything like that, then why are you doing it? So don't create habits just for the sake of checking them off. Really think about how they can energize you.
I love that. And also those, like you said, will be the habits you'll continue to build. And then if there's something else you want to bring in, that's a habit that it may be one of those where you're like, but I know that I need this. I know this is going to be like a next level thing. You take the ones that have been, shall we say, easy to do, right? The ones that that you've locked in, and then you can anchor those new habits to the ones that you have locked in. So you can use them as a foundation for the growth that you want.
Yes, so smart.
Fantastic. Okay. I think we're good. We're going to get into the rapid wrap up. But before we do, please tell everyone where we can find you online.
Yeah. Well, you can tune into the Mindful Productivity Podcast anywhere podcasts are found. Otherwise, you can find all the resources I offer over at mindfulproductivityblog.com. And I'm also hanging out on Instagram most of the time at the same handle there.
Awesome. And I'll make sure to have all of that in the show notes so you can find Sarah easily. All right. Rapid wrap up time. Would you please fill in the blanks for me? Okay. A song that lifts my spirits, makes me dance.
Ooh, that's a hard one. I think it's mainly because I listen to so much EDM and techno. So I don't even know like where I would begin. But if you Google anything on YouTube or look up a playlist, that's normally what I'm listening to is tons of EDM.
Okay. Well, I'll find EDM playlist and I'll pick something wonderful and random and energizing and put it on the Positively Living Podcast Spotify playlist. Okay. How about a quote or a mantra that inspires me that I share often?
There's a quote that I always come back to. I actually used it a lot when I was going through some hard things in life. And it was something along the lines of, we must take our grief and use it as fuel moving forward. I'm totally not quoting it right. I'll have to find it and send it to you. But it was something along the lines of looking at what we're going through as fuel for our journey ahead. And that felt very profound to me.
Yeah, I like that. Okay. Yeah, definitely send me the specific one. But I think the concept there is let our challenges drive us, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How about a resource, a book or an app besides Notion that's made my life easier?
Yeah, I have been loving Atomic Habits by James Clear. That's one of my favorite books. I know a lot of people recommend that, but I have found so many wonderful things in that. So I always reference that often.
You won't see me arguing. It's on my bookshelf and I absolutely agree with it. And he takes a lot from some of the originators, Charles Duhigg and The Power of Habit. And it's really good. And it speaks to what you're talking about with just taking the tiny steps and the tiny steps that really work for you. All right. And last, but definitely not least, what are you grateful for today, Sarah?
I am grateful for my office and the sanctuary that it is. I just love being in here and I love all the things that I've curated and the natural light that pours through. And I've got this beautiful view of this forest behind our place. And so every time I'm in here, it just brings me a lot of joy.
That sounds amazing. Well, I am most certainly grateful for you that we connected and that you were willing to join me and share all that you've gone through and all of your wisdom with us. So thank you, Sarah, for shining your light in this world and for sharing it with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you for joining me today. Your time is precious and limited, and I'm honored you chose to spend it with me. If you have feedback, questions, or want to schedule a chat, head to positivelyproductive.com/connect. And if you are looking for any of the resources referenced on the podcast, from books to products to training and more, go to positivelyproductive.com/resources.